Ching.
Man, look who's back. Me, that's who's back. Look who's back.
Guess who's back? Guess who's back?
Of course, our good buddy James Boggs is here nice and early, ready to welcome us into another episode of this Uncanny Earth, episode 247. Today we're talking about biblical archaeology, but not in the sense you're thinking. We're going to go over a couple things in the Bible. We're going to talk about what we think it could have been, because the Bible's a lot of it's left up to interpretation because a lot of us were not there when these events happened. And for those of you that were and would like to be on the show, please come on the show, because that would be a really interesting show to have. As always, I am your host, Robert Solomon. With me is the mass maker of mayhem himself. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Spider.
Boom. Welcome back. It's like I just saw everybody not like a day ago. And the day before that, and the day before that, and the day before that.
You see people too much.
I got all kinds of shows. So I got like that morning show now that's like daily in the morning, like 6 in the morning.
Are you up at 6 in the morning?
No, there's actually secrets about that, but I'm supposed to be up at 6 in the morning. So if you listen to it, I will tell you that I'm up at 6 in the morning. That's production magic.
Ooh, don't let all the secrets out. So what have you been talking about on the old morning show?
News and opinions. Like since that's what morning shows are, they're just about like news first. I do that
morning shows
all the time during the morning shows.
Yeah, it's 6 o'clock.
And
6 a.m.
Yeah, I pick up the day's headlines from the week before, because it's like last week's news, and I talk about them. And there's some political stuff in there. There's some science stuff in there. Anybody who's listened to it so far will know that I talk a lot about space and dinosaurs, because I like space and dinosaurs. So if anybody wants to, no, I cut you off. Go ahead.
What did you talk about last? What was your last headlined episode about?
Well, it's always several different things, because I go down a bunch of different headlines. I don't just stick to one topic. I talked about, there was some virus stuff I talked about, and so that's going to generate some controversy, I'm sure. There was some Trump stuff, some Biden stuff. I went on a little mini rant about how nobody actually wants to see a Trump-Biden rematch in 24. I'm sure some people do, but most people don't. And I had a little bit to say about all that, but yeah, it's entertaining to me anyway. So I don't know if anybody's tuned in yet, but if they have, you'll get some news and some controversy.
So, what is your format for this thing? Because I've yet to listen to it. I'm not up at 6 in the morning like some of you heathens are, unless I'm up for work. If I ain't up for work, I ain't up at 6, you heathens.
Well, I mean, like all the shows, it's available on demand on YouTube, so everybody can do that. And I just go down, like I'll pull up usually like MSN and do like a news aggregator and check all the different things. Like I pick stories from Associated Press, from Reuters, from phys.org, phys.org, which is one of my favorites. They always have space stuff. I love talking about space. And I'll pick some headlines here or there. I'll talk about them, and then I'll go on and do that for about a half hour or so.
How many days a week do you do? Do you do it every day? Do you do it Monday through Friday?
Every day.
Every day.
Every day.
You have that much to talk about every day. How long is your show?
Just a half hour each day.
Yeah, I guess for a half hour that would work.
Yeah. As a consequence, I did increase the storage space for our video storage.
Well,
Not
yeah,
that anybody out there cares. So it's just like, oh well, whatever. Like, when are you guys gonna get to the real show? Whatever. But
this is the real show.
We doubled our space, because that way we don't have to worry about, like, I'm trying to still keep up on everything, but that way we don't worry about missing some deletes. Delete some deets.
Delete some deets. All right. So how much of the Bible are you versed in, would you say?
Over the years, and it has been a while since my last read, I'll say that. But over the years, I have read at least 3 translations, plus one of the plus the Jewish one I've read the Talmud, but I don't remember how different that was. I know that there was definitely some differences, and it was all Old Testament. Everybody, if you know religion, you know that. But I've read a copy of the King James because that's what I first got when I was going to church back in the day. Um, I've read the New Living Translation, and I've read something else. I don't remember what the third one was, but
The New International Version, because there's that too.
could have been. That's
That's
probably
the
it because that's the
NIV.
one everybody gets a chance to read because that's the most common, I think. The King James one used to be super common, and it's kind of been pushed out because it's embellished here and there, which that was of the times, and that's what King James wanted. And people who are really super conservative like that embellishment because it adds weight to their arguments and things, whereas the New International is more like even, like straight up telling. And then the New Living Translation is more like they changed some of the language to be more modern, so it was like easier to understand and to empathize with, I think was the term. I don't remember. Somebody in the Baptist church I was in um had told me about it, and I read that one.
Hmm. So what we'll be reading from today is this is a beast of a thing. No, this one's kind of a monster of a book here. This one is. This is the concordant, literal version of the New Testament, basically pulling from Hebrew and all other things. So that's it's akin to the closest thing you can get to the actual like
Mhm.
scriptures themselves. So, anyways, welcome everybody, episode 247. So, what do you know about Adam and Eve? Let me start off there. What do you because that's where we're going to start, obviously. What do you know?
Well, if we're talking biblically,
Bibiki.
if we're talking biblically, then Adam and Eve were the first humans created as far as Christianity is concerned, because they don't consider Lilith and all that to be part of the canon. So God created Adam first, and from the dirt and the dust, and then he longed for companionship, and so God created Eve from a rib after he put Adam to sleep, and the two of them were supposed to be caretakers over the Garden of Eden and over all living things of the earth, depending on the translation. Some of them don't say that. Some of them just only specifically say the Garden of Eden. Other things say you will be caretakers or protectors or whatever over the earth's creatures.
Right.
But like I said, translation differences. So, and they, as we are told through the stories, they were told not to eat from the tree of life and from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which some translations just call it the tree of good and evil, which it's an important distinction because the knowledge part
Yes.
is what's important.
Yep.
Um, and they end up eating from the tree of good and evil, or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil,
That's
after
correct.
being explained to that by a serpent that convinced Eve to take the fruit and share it with Adam. And for that, they were thrown out of Eden
Hmm.
because they had knowledge they weren't supposed to have, and the gates of Eden were locked with a flaming angel. Well, not a flaming angel, but he had a flaming sword. And they then went out into the wilderness and had children. People know what happened after that. And then after that is where their story kind of ends, at least as far as most of the translations go.
Okay. Okay, and you're not wrong. I mean, there's
It's
other
really
books outside
basic.
of that. There's other books
Mhm.
outside of that that talk about like
Yeah,
the Book of Adam and Eve, which I have.
this is the
In
real
the
basic version you'll get through most
Yeah.
of without getting into some of the extra and the apocrypha. So,
So let's backtrack a little bit here. And hello to Elizabeth. Welcome back, Elizabeth. Good seeing you again. I remember seeing you 2 weeks ago. I did see you last week, but I was not here. I caught some of last week's episode where I was at, but I want to get into what I like to call the very first human beings. And we're going to go to Genesis 1:27. Don't worry, this isn't going to be one of those where you have to have a Bible to follow along. You don't got to worry about it. If you'd like to, you can. I'm not going to read like passage after passage, just a few to kind of get it planted in your brain here. So we're going to go to Genesis 1:27, and what it says is, so Elohim created humanity in his image. In the image of Elohim, he created it, male and female, he created them. So this is before the Adam and Eve story. This is the sixth day. This is the day where he creates humanity. And he goes on to say that Elohim blessed them, and Elohim said to them, be fruitful, increase, fill the earth and subdue it, hold sway over the fish of the sea and over the fire of the heavens, over every domestic beast, over all the earth, and over every animal that is moving on the earth. And he goes on to say that since I have given you all sealed yielding herbage that is on the face of the entire earth, and every tree on which there is the fruit of a seed yielding tree, it shall be yours for food. And to every animal of the earth, to every flower of the heavens, and to every creeper on the earth, in which there is a living soul, I have given all green herbage for food, and it came to be so. And so he goes on to say that when he made it, he beheld that it was very good. Now, if we look at what we are discussing tonight, this predates Adam and Eve. He's talking about creating humanity. He's not talking about creating two people. So I want to make sure people understand something here. A lot of people that are, I don't want to say anti-Christian, but a lot of people in the science community always like to point that Adam and Eve was a incestuous story. However, this proves it to not be so, because it says he creates humanity first. So he's creating humanity. He's creating his whole humanity. Humanity, think of many beings. You don't think of just two people. Humanity would be multiple beings that he creates. And if we go further on, when we talk about Cain and Abel, and Cain slaying his brother Abel, which we have talked about before on previous shows, we discussed the tomb of Abel that sits in Syria, in modern day Syria, and the giant sarcophagus that sits there that rests the supposed grave of Abel, Tel Marduk, as it were. As many of you know, once he was slain, Cain goes off to Nod, and he says, if I go to these places, they will kill me. Now, first of all, who is they? If God only created two people, if he only created an Adam and an Eve, there would not be a multitude of people. It'd be just two people. However, we're gonna get into some more of that too. I got another little thing for you guys that hopefully the wheels are turning in your heads and everything is clicking, because everything is clicking today on the show. So there you have the basic story of how mankind was created. God basically creates them, and boom, here we go. Now, the interesting aspect here is once we get into it further and we start talking about Adam, right? The Adam and Eve story. So he calls a stupor basically to fall on Adam. And this is where he creates Eve. Now, what he does is he takes Adam and Eve and he puts them in this garden, right? Puts them in the garden itself. Let me see if I can find the passage here for you guys. He says, give me 1 second. Flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. This was talking about creating the female. But he puts them in the garden as, we have to understand, as caretakers of the garden itself. We have to look at Adam and Eve as not being just people who are lazing about. These are the caretakers of the garden. Now, if we look at the garden as being in the center of the surrounding areas, then we have to understand that the cities would have been provided nutrients, sustenance from the Garden of Eden. It wouldn't have just came from wherever, because the Garden of Eden had every known plant, it had animal species, it had everything there needed for people to survive. And they could eat of all the fruit in the garden except the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was the one they couldn't eat off of, because they ate off of it, they would become as gods, and surely they would die. Which we can take that a couple of different ways, and we can expound upon that at some point. So once they eat of it, their eyes are open. They see as gods do. I mean, they're created from him, so of course they're going to see as gods do. But the interesting thing among this, and one of my personal favorite lines of this, and hello, Apple, welcome, is the line, and we're going to turn the page here. And this comes from Genesis 1:16. And this is when he's talking about, as he's punishing both Adam and Eve for the sin that they have caused by eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This is what he says to the woman. And to the woman, he said, this is Genesis 3:16. I shall increase, yea, increase your grief and the groanings of your pregnancy. In grief shall you bear children. Now let's back up a little bit here, and let's break something down here. He's going to increase the grief and the pain of childbirth. Increase. He didn't say he was going to all of a sudden put pain when she has children. Let's get into this a little bit here. Pregnancy. So she was able to get pregnant prior to them being removed from the Garden of Eden, meaning that Adam and Eve could have had children, because we do not know the time lapse that happens from when God puts Adam and Eve into the garden and when they eat from the tree of good and evil. We don't have that time lapse. We can just say, okay, between these two time periods was 5 years, it was 10 years. Heck, we can only go in the increments that we know best by the calendars that we use today. We can't go off another time period that we don't really understand. So this shows me that now Eve is able to have children. She's always been able to have children. She wasn't just all of a sudden able to have children when they are removed from the garden itself. She was able to be pregnant in the garden, inside of the garden. Now, Adam and Eve were the only ones that were talked about being removed. So what if the children of Adam and Eve tended the garden and still tend to that garden this day? Now, nobody knows where the garden is. Some say it was taken by God. Others say it was destroyed. Others still say that it's out there. We just can't find it, or that it's basically a dimensional rift that no one can get into because of the flying cherubim and the flaming sword. You can't get into it. And so what we see here is we see a bevy of different things and ideas that we have to focus on. One being that humanity was created first before Adam and Eve. So here's God who creates humanity and tells them, go be fruitful, go multiply. Go be fruitful, multiply humanity. He doesn't name Adam and Eve. It's not till a little bit later on when he creates the Garden of Eden, then creates Adam and Eve for the sole purpose of being caretakers in said garden, that he literally put them in the garden. Here are these two people inside of the garden. And for some reason, she gets tempted by the serpent. The serpent can mean many things. The tree itself could mean, the apple isn't necessarily an apple, but it's hard to expound upon what that could be precisely. Some people have said it was of a sexual nature. Others said it was of a criminal nature. Just something wasn't right.
Or even just an entirely different fruit, like a pomegranate or something like that. And there's all kinds of stories about it.
We don't know. We can just speculate at this time. But once they're removed, then God punishes Eve by increasing her pain during childbirth, meaning that she didn't have pain during childbirth previous. Meaning there could be other children that we don't know about, that we were not told about, because we have to remember, this is something I want you all to remember. The Old Testament, while some of it is our history in a way, a lot of it is more the Jewish history than it is anybody else's history. Once, because Abraham becomes the father of many nations. It's a song. Everybody knows the song. Once that happens, it sort of splits and people go their kind of own way, and histories kind of unfold in those ways. But for the most part, the latter part of the Old Testament is basically Jews. It's a Jewish driven book. But this first part is where humanity gets its initial start. And like I said, when it goes on to talk about Cain killing Abel, he goes off to Nod, the land of Nod. And he says, well, they will kill me. Well, who is they? If God only made two people, who is they? Who are you talking about killing you? You can't be talking about your father and your mother, because you're going away from them. You're going away from your home. You're going to a whole other region to live, and they will kill you. Well, there can only be one explanation for that. There's people there. There's people. What do you think, Spider? What are your thoughts on what I just talked about?
Well, there's an interesting point to make about the pregnancy and increasing the pain and things of childbirth, in that if we assume that the Garden of Eden was basically a perfect place, or at least a place where all of a person's needs were taken care of, we can look at it from a different perspective. If we look at it from not necessarily the ancient astronaut perspective, but from a stronger civilization, like a previous civilization, then within the quote unquote garden, they were civilized people, supposedly, and they may have had certain medical advances. Like we have medications and all kinds of things to help people through pregnancy. And so the subtext could be, we're kicking you out of this area where we have expertise. We have ways to make things easier on you. Now you're going to be out there. It's not going to be easy for you. You're not going to have pain medications. You're not going to have trained people to keep you calm. You're not going to have all these things. So you can look at it from the same perspective as a more advanced civilization. You don't have to call it aliens and you don't have to call it ancient astronauts, but you can look at it as a previous civilization that we've lost the details of, and it's now part of mythology.
We have to understand too, this is an antediluvian world. This is pre-flood. This is before Noah gets the boat and the whole world gets thrown underwater. And before anybody's like, well, that's not true. Why does every religion, every culture have a flood myth? Every single one. It's not like the Bible has only one. Mesopotamian flood myths exist. Babylonian flood myths exist. Native American flood myths exist. South American flood myths exist. All these exist, but you're telling me that that can't be correct? I seriously doubt. I would weigh my soul in a feather on the fact that there has been a worldwide flood at some point. I mean,
If not a worldwide flood, worldwide flooding, which
yeah,
is kind of a bit of nuance, but it opens the door up to not having the entire planet covered in water, but much of the civilized quote unquote world that we know of covered in water. Because at the time, people lived mostly in lowlands. They didn't go up to high mountains just because. They went down where there was food, where there's water, where there's all these things. So if you have flooding that occurs across much of the planet, not covering the entire planet, but at least covering like chunks of it, like when the ice age ended with the glaciers and things melting, people had to go up, people had to escape. So there's going to be a lot of stories from a lot of different cultures about that phenomenon.
that's true. That's true. It wouldn't just be one select group, especially if the flooding takes place at different time periods. You know, if a flood happens here in this time
Timelines
period,
again.
and once again, you know, it would be the same as if the South, when it floods, when they have big floods, we talk about it. It's on the news. It goes on for 5-10 years. Look at how we have talked about 9/11. We still remember 9/11. Everybody still remembers 9/11. That is something to keep in mind, how we remember things, how we remembered 9/11, or how we remembered, Hiroshima and Nagasaki and all that. So I want you guys to keep that in the back of your head, like remembering these things that have happened. And I want you guys to kind of keep that in there in the back of your head. So the next thing I want to talk about, and we're going to continue on in our discussion of Genesis here, is the Tower of Babel. Now, a lot of you probably know what the Tower of Babel was. It was a big city, and then they build this enormous tower to try to touch God. They say, nobody is above us. Let us make a home in the heavens. And I will give it to you here from Genesis 11:4, 11:4. And they said, grant attention. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the surface of the entire earth. Then Yahweh descended to see the city and the tower that the sons of humanity had built. Yahweh said, behold, they are one people with one language for all of them. And this is what they start to do. Now, anything they plan to do will not be restricted for them. Great attention. Do let us descend, and do let us disintegrate their language there, so that each man may not hearken to the language of his associate. So this is where they basically split humanity. They start splitting humanity. Now, the one thing I want you guys to pay close attention to is the fact that he says, let us descend. Not just himself descending. Let us descend. Now, us could mean a variety of things. Is he talking about himself in the Trinity? Is he talking about himself and the angels? descending down with him. There's a couple different explanations you can run up from this. However, besides that, it talks of mankind coming together to build this tower in their arrogance, right? Excuse me. And in their arrogance, they build this tower. It's huge. There's a couple of different paintings. There's the Tower of Babel by Peter Bruegel, the Elder from 1563 that a lot of you have probably seen. It's this big rounded shape. Let me see if I can pull it up for you guys here.
Like a corkscrew kind of ziggurat sort of thing.
Almost like a ziggurat. I'll pull it up for the people and let the people see it. They'll be excited. All right, let me see here. I got to remember how to do this because it's been on. There we go. Present. Share screen. And there you guys go. So as you can see, that is just one of the many artist renditions of the Tower of Babylon. Look how massive that thing is. It goes as high as you can see at the top here. There's a cloud circling the very top of it. Now, some scholars go on to say that it isn't the actual tower, but mankind's arrogance is the reasoning why things were separated, because man says, hey, we can become better than God. We'll build something that's even bigger than God. And God says, no, you can't become better than us. So we're going to go ahead and take care of that for you.
And it's interesting. There's a few different interpretations. There's that one where it's metaphorical, where it's not an actual tower, but it's like, hey, we're going to try to teach ourselves to be godlike and things like that, in which case he says absolutely not, which is a very left-hand path idea for anybody who knows about that kind of stuff that I talked about on my old show. And you can go back and watch those episodes again, because that's the point of those, is trying to ascend yourself to a godlike state, more or less. But there's also interpretations, again, going back to the previous civilization, where they were more technologically advanced. Some people say that potentially by going to the heavens, they were trying to build rockets and ships and things to be able to fly up to wherever the gods came from. Other people say that they were trying to build, like in the Halo franchise, where you have the space elevators. It's a big long tether that goes all up to a station above the planet. And it's interesting because we see this theme a lot after this in other cultures as well, about people like, you can't just go straight to heaven. You can't just go straight to God, even though it's supposed to be up above us. You can't go there. You have to go through hoops. You have to die first. You have to do these things. Like the Egyptians said, hey, the only way you go is we got to mummify you. You travel through the underworld, and then you can fly off in the celestial boat. And a lot of other civilizations were the same way. You don't just get to go. And it's because of this, because people wanted to go and they tried to go and were told not to, or cast down and scattered and separated. And the language part could even be so simple as just, hey, a bunch of us got scattered by a disaster and we went to different areas, and because we went to different areas, our language changed and adapted to where we went. Because a lot of languages have a common base. Not all of them. There's a lot of dead languages out there, but a lot of languages are based on a Semitic root or something like that. And so you can trace a lot of that back, even though they're clearly different styles and different languages. But all speculation.
100%. So the next thing I want to get into, and a lot of you probably heard of this before, is, and this is where I want you guys to remember that when tragedy strikes, it's usually passed down through multiple generations, and it's talked about in multiple generations. And I want to talk about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, many of you know that Sodom and Gomorrah was the place of ill repute. It was where heathenry and wickedness and everything else that was vile in God's eyes happened. It happened in these two cities. And so Abraham and his son Lot and wives and daughters and all that, they get out. They're going there to preach, and well, God says, okay, if you can find, this many righteous people, I'll spare the city. Well, they can't find that many. Then God says, well, if you can find this many, then I'll spare the city, so on and so forth. So it gets down to like one. If you can find one righteous person in the city, I'll spare it. And God's like, he can't. They can't find any. And this runs you a lot of the story of Iran with the pillars, where it was the same. Like it was very anti-Allah, and people were like, we'll do what we want. And Allah sends HUD into the cities. HUD tells him, hey, if you don't repent, God's going to strike the city down. So there is some similarities here, and you have to wonder if maybe it's being told that way, but I don't think so. I think it's a different part. But once again, I can't 100% prove that without a shadow of a doubt. So right now we're going to look for Genesis 19:23, and this is where he's talking about the destruction. He says, the sun, it came forth over the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then Yahweh caused sulfur to rain on Sodom and on Gomorrah. Oh, Lot's nephew. You're right. My bad. That was my fault. Then Yahweh, he caused sulfur to rain on Sodom and on Gomorrah, and fire from Yahweh from the heavens. Thus he overturned those cities and the entire basin and all those dwelling in the cities and everything sprouting from the ground. Now, Lot's wife ends up looking back behind her, and she becomes a pillar of salt. Now, something I want to get into here, and I got this in my notes. So there was 2 city mounds found on the Jordan River. And at the site is a substance called tritonite. Now, what tritonite is, when you drop a nuclear bomb on something or in the area, what happens is a part of a glass is caused from the heat of the explosion. This has been found in the Sahara Desert. This has been found in India. This glass has been found on a predominant part or parts of the world. And so what they end up finding is this tritonite. And at first, when they're digging up pottery. And they find pottery, and the one side's glazed. So they think, okay, this can't be right, because glazed pottery doesn't come out well until after this happens. But then they turn the pot over and it's not glazed. The whole thing isn't glazed, only parts of it. And they find this tritonite after it's sent into a lab and it gets sent back, and it's tritonite. And I was watching a video, and I was reading a little bit too about somebody saying that it could have been a meteorite that struck it. A lot of people think that God can't utilize the things around him. Everybody thinks that, oh my goodness, it's this big crazy event that happens, when it could have happened much like the meteorite that impacted Tunguska.
Blew up in the air.
Yeah, just blew up in the air. Supposedly, like nobody knows really what that was. It could have been a plethora of things. I've seen different documentaries on what it could have been: a meteorite, a nuclear bomb, an alien invasion. I've seen all sorts of things on the Tunguska. And actually, somebody I knew from work, somebody that I worked with her. You didn't work with her. She worked over in like the Land's End area. Her grandmother lived close enough that she remembered that incident.
Anastasia.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. What I'm talking about.
She even had a name that was, and she had the look. She had kind of like that Eastern European facial structure.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, because I asked her about that. I go, do you know about Tunguska? And she's like, was that the place where the meteorite fell? I was like, yeah, that's it. She said my grandma remembers that happening. Like she lived close enough to where she could hear the blast and like experience that kind of shockwave. Because I guess it was felt in London. It had reached all the way out to London. It was that impactful. You should have seen the forest. The fact that the trees were all flattened, all of them. Like it had pressed down the trees with that much force.
The kinetic just shockwave that spread out.
Yeah. And this was basically the same. And they said that Lot's wife could have suffered a similar fate by the shockwaves. The shockwaves hitting the ground, and then,
the reason you don't look behind you is because you see the flash, it blinds you, and then you don't think to take cover. Yep. Whereas the other ones, they're meant to just go, run, book it. She turns around, she gets like,
Correct.
oh my gosh, and then she's frozen in either fear or whatever. Gets you.
And that's what got her. Once she got blinded by it, the shockwave happened. Oh yeah, I remember that. But the interesting part about Sodom and Gomorrah to me is the fact that it is talked about further on in both the Old and the New Testament. It's talked about in different books, which leads me to believe that it's one of those stories that was passed down from generations, generation after generation. Because we see that with how many people still know about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs being dropped in Japan. Excuse me. How many people know about the World Trade Center, the World Trade Towers getting planes flowing into them? That's not something you forget. You don't forget the nuclear bomb droppings, and that keeps going. That will reverberate throughout history. And you kind of have to wonder. And now we have to remember too that Sodom and Gomorrah is after the flood. This takes place after the flood happens. So I just want everybody to understand that. And so when they find this stuff, when they find these pottery shards that have been hit with tritonite, you have to kind of wonder what is real and what isn't at that point. Because a lot of people say, well, it didn't exist, or how that didn't happen. But then you find pieces like that sort of prove that something there happened. And in order for tritonite to actually happen, or trinitite to actually happen, is it has to be from a heated source. So it has to be a heat incident. A lot of times when they're finding these cities and stuff, they look for arrowheads to see if an army came through, and that's who devastated the city. Was an army just came through, razed it, burned it, got rid of it. But they didn't find these arrowheads at this site along the Jordan River. They found these pottery shards with tritonite or trinitite on it, like there on the pottery. So, and then it gets discussed down multiple times. And then you have to wonder if other civilizations just changed the name of Sodom and Gomorrah to another city. Like I said, it's very interesting to me.
And another thing to remember is that even the Talmud is based partially off of older sources. Some of the stories in the earliest known versions of the Bible and the Jewish versions before that are adaptations from the Sumerian stories that came before that. And Abraham himself was a Sumerian. So their culture has continued from all through that. So a lot of these stories could have started before they even started writing things down. Like the Sumerians wrote things in the cuneiform, and we don't have a lot from them, but we know some epic tales and things like that. But even then, the civilization before them may not have really written hardly anything down, if at all. So there's a lot that's buried so far into the past, and it's like a 1,000 year game of telephone. Somebody says, "Hey, this thing happened. Tell everybody you know." "Hey, this thing happened. Tell everybody you know." And the details and the facts, they change enough that modern people look, where we think we're very intellectual and we're smart and we can analyze all these clues from the past, we think we know that, oh yeah, that's just mythology. This is that. When you're ignoring the evidence and you're ignoring the experiences that these ancient people had, they experienced something. It may not have been as grand as what they wrote about, but that's the story that we have now. And nobody really wants to seriously investigate that so much. And that's where the problem is. Like, there's so much of this buried in there that we could really know about our history as a species, and people don't want to take it seriously. They're just like, oh yeah, it's just stories. But where did the stories come from?
Yeah, because all the stories have a centralized piece involved in them. You can't have a story without an origin. Here we go.
Like in India, we talked about India in the Vedics of India. They talk about this great war that the gods had, where they just struck down mountains and things with these thunderbolts and stuff. And there's evidence of events happening. You've got the glassed areas, you've got the trinitite, you've got and they believe these things there. It's just, again, a lot of people think, oh yeah, it's obviously just stories. It's not possible because nobody could have developed anything like this but us, or could they?
And that's what I think a lot of people don't truly understand is things get passed down. Whether you believe it or not, things do get passed down. That's just the way it is. We can sit here all day. We can speculate on what happened and this, that, and the third. When you have multiple sources that are claiming this and claiming what exactly is happening, that's when you have to wonder, like, okay, what's going on here? And, how do we fix it? Or how do we make it make sense to people? Because I'm sure people back then, they didn't have the same language as we do. They didn't have the same mannerisms, the same
Mm.
word structures as we did. So how did they survive that? How did they keep moving that forward? Well, they put it in a place, in a religious text, or in a place that people would say, you know what? I'm going to read that text one day. This is the book of the people. And I think they knew that. I think they knew that all these things would get written down, would get shared at some point further on into the future. I don't think it's just by accident that we're finding these things out. I think it's by sheer writing things down, keeping memorization, passing the legends along. Even if there is a game of telephone, there's always a snag of truth in the game of telephone. There's always an origin based point in the game of telephone. True.
Yeah, interesting point.
Interesting point. So another point I want to get into here, one of my more like interesting aspects here is what we know as the basic the walls of Jericho. And we have talked about this on a show previous and prior a little bit, not too much. We talked about it a little bit. But from this, we're going to go into Joshua 6:12, and it says, Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the coffer of Yahweh. The 7 priests carrying the 7 alarm trumpets marched before the coffer of Yahweh and blew the trumpets continuously. The vanguard marched before them, and the rear guard marched behind the coffer of Yahweh, with the trumpets being blown continuously. So they marched around the city one time on the second day and returned to the camp, and thus they did for 6 days. It came to be on the 7th day that they rose early when the dawn ascended and marched around the city according to this custom 7 times. That was the only day they marched around the city was 7 times. And it came to be at the 7th time when the priest blew the trumpets that Joshua ordered the people, shout, for Yahweh has delivered the city to you. Yet the city will come to be doomed, and it shall, and all that is in it, be devoted to Yahweh. And it goes on to say, but this, so when this happens, and it goes on in 20, it says, so when the priest blew the trumpets and the people shouted, it came to be when the people heard the sound of the trumpet and the people shouted a loud shout that the wall fell under it, and the people went up toward the city, each man in front of him, and they took the city. They took the city. The city fell. What was the reasoning behind why the city fell? Now, I know my host here has a couple different thoughts about this one. It sounds almost like a kinetic sound wave, but the fact that they've got people shouting has to be something. There's something to that point. And blowing the trumpets, it's almost like whatever the walls were made out of wasn't very soundproof, in my honest opinion.
It could have been a frequency, not necessarily like a massive sonic weapon of sorts, but it could have just been a frequency that they figured out. And we talked briefly too in the past about how the number of times walking around could have potentially have been charging whatever this thing was. Like it had to charge the battery through kinetic energy or something like that before you released it. Another interesting point, though, is because of the shouting, vocalization is a very important part of most really solid martial arts, because it's the release of air as you're making a shout, as you're making a sound, that adds strength and power to a strike. So while the the story doesn't say that they physically did anything. The fact that they had themselves shouting, plus the trumpets, plus they had, the Ark of the Covenant basically around with them. And we speculate. We speculate that it was an object of some kind of really massive power. And that it's almost like when they were marching once a day, they were trying to make the inside folks kind of complacent. Oh yeah, they're going to come out and they're going to do their little march. But they could also have been testing the charge. They could have been testing how well it charges once per day. Just do a turnaround, see how much it goes. And on that last day, like, okay, tests are done, time to do it. And whatever it is, it hit a frequency that resonated with whatever the walls were. They could have been just some form of stone, but anything can fall apart with the right frequency.
True.
They know how sound functions these days. I mean, we've even had sonic weapons nowadays that we can't explain. They brushed them off recently. That thing about Havana syndrome in Cuba, where people were targeted by basically a sonic-based weapon that made them sick and made them feel like out of sorts. And the whole thing got tossed aside. They did some testing and decided that it wasn't anything and whatever, and then you're never going to hear about it again. But I know they found something, I'm sure, because that's kind of like, way too suspicious. You said that nothing happened. But it's very similar. Sonic technology has been used for other things throughout the centuries. Like at Stonehenge, you've got the parts of the area can be amplified so that you can talk at one end of it and you can hear it echoing throughout the entire structure. And that's even with all the gaps and pieces missing these days. So we know that ancient people knew something about frequencies. They knew about sonic something in general, whether it was technology or not, is regardless. But it's very interesting, all the little details that you can pick out from here, that they clearly knew something that we don't.
And that's the part that interests me the most, I think, is just the little things that you don't pick up on unless you actually read it, unless you actually decipher it, pick it apart word by word to fully understand, to fully grab what it is. Now, what they've also said is that it was emitting a radiation, so to speak, because anybody that touched the Ark of the Covenant died instantaneously. I remember it was falling and somebody went to grab it, and that was it. It basically flashed them, basically killed them instantaneously. Because I have heard reports that it was a form of radiation inside of the ark itself was a form of radiation, and talking to God and all that. But what if that is the case? What if this radiation is an offshoot of God himself, like being around God's presence? We forget that Moses saw just the hand of God as he was passing by, and his hair turned white. Whole head of hair turned white after he saw the passing. He didn't see all of God. You can't see all of God's glory, or else it will kill you, essentially. And if we look at what radiation does, if you're around radiation, if you get to the full aspect of radiation, it will without a doubt kill you. There's no debate about that. Radiation will kill you the closer you are to it. Obviously, the further you're away from it, you're fine. And so when we look at this stuff, we look at it and say, okay, here's this thing that they're carrying around. And when one person touched it, they basically disintegrated. There's a lot of interesting points to it, especially when you really break it down. You break down the events that happen in the Old Testament, and then you break them down with some of the new, because the Old Testament has a lot more events that happen like this, as for the New Testament is more about the salvation, the coming of the Lamb, the healing, the sort of reconnecting. Because what people don't understand about the New Testament is Christ didn't come back for everybody at first. He came back to his people, the Jews. He was the first ones that they were trying to save. He wasn't trying to save it first to everybody. Everybody would have been fine for the most part because they weren't his people. You notice in the book, the Old Testament, God is harsher on his people than he is on anybody else because they have their camps, they have their encampment set up, and people from other belief systems could come in and
Hmm.
eat with them and drink with them, but they had to follow their customs. That's why, they had to follow these customs, um, because if they didn't, they weren't allowed in. But if they did, they could come in, they could eat with them, they could partake with them, they could even sleep in these camps as long as they followed whatever rules they had at the
Hmm.
time and at present. And when you read that, you understand that, okay, Christ came back first for his people. Because if you read about the Jews in the Old Testament, Ezekiel goes on to talk about, if I go over here, these people will accept me. They're not Jews. Remind, they're not Jews that he's talking about. Ezekiel isn't talking about Jews. I think it's Ezekiel 3, where he says, if I go here, they'll listen. And why don't you send me there? And God says, I know this. I know they will listen. They'll listen and they will worship me. And he says, we have to go to our people because they're the most hard headed. When you read the Old Testament, they literally are. A lot of people will say, the Old Testament, this, that, and the third. But if you read it, it's a survival manual. It's about how a group of people survived and had to survive. No eating shellfish. And a lot of people say, well, it says this, if you don't properly clean shellfish or cook it properly, it can kill you. Without a doubt, it can kill you. And there's people that have allergies to it that'll die. And there's a lot of different things and avenues that we can talk about, but that's just one. And so what we see here is we see things happen like a whole city collapse, all the walls come tumbling down, the walls of Jericho come tumbling down, and frequencies. Because just because we look at it and say, oh, there's no way, but there's got to be a scientific explanation for all of it, every single part of it, especially things like this that happen. And yeah, it could have been once they shouted, that frequency hit that tonal note. Once that tonal note was hidden, it caused cracks in the walls. The walls came tumbling down. Just like a meteor hitting the Sodom and Gomorrah. It's not toward to say that God couldn't have made that happen. On that day, it just happened to happen. So I don't know.
And it's a practical thing that we know that this works because it's a common joke in cartoons and things for opera singers to break glass.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a thing that actually happens. That's why it's a joke.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
parodied all the time. And a band called Ween from the 90s were always apparently trying to find something called the brown note, which would make people defecate into their pants at a show.
Right.
So, and it sounds silly and sounds dumb, but science says it could happen. It triggers something in your brain goes, oh no, we have to go to the bathroom, boom. So, we know frequencies can do these dumb things and these powerful things, and we know that it works. And we use sonics a lot. We use them to measure things in the ground. We use them to break up mines, like mining operations and things like that. We use sonics a lot. And who's to say that the people before us didn't understand it a little more than we did?
Right. Right. I mean, imagine how you feel when you listen to your favorite song.
Mm-hmm. It affects the brainwaves.
It affects the brainwaves, and certain music at certain frequencies cause a person to feel happy, they feel sad, they feel angry, they feel whatever. And that's proven. That's scientific proven fact that listening to certain kinds of music changes your brainwave patterns a bit to mimic that field. Now, let's say this though, it doesn't make you go out and kill people. I've never listened to anything I've had. I'm like, man, I gotta kill somebody right now. No. So I don't think it goes that far, but I think it does change your thought patterns in a roundabout way.
Yeah. And you've had people who've been kind of crazy throughout the years. Like you've had Charles Manson, who said he listened to the Beatles' White Album and it told him that he had to go on his killing spree and purge whoever. So some people, it will affect them in weird ways if they're already kind of unstable.
Yeah.
So, art does that. People will see a painting and they'll just be stunned by it and they'll cry and they won't know why. Or they'll hear a song that just gets them like, oh, angry and riled up.
Yep.
And it's just That's how our brains are. Our brains are built to pick up on these audio visual cues, and they have been like that for a very, very, very long time.
And I don't think it'll stop. So, anyways, that's another episode of This Uncanny Earth, the weekly show that has you asking the questions and we provide the answers where and how we can. We 100% appreciate everybody stopping by. James, Elizabeth, Apple, Little Beans and Rice, the whole nine, the whole crew came through tonight for our show, and we appreciate each and every one of you. We love each and every one of you. We hope you guys enjoyed it. Be sure to check us out on our other platforms and other shows that we do. We've got a morning show now that our good buddy Spider here does. We have us on our Twitch channels playing all kinds of crazy video games, and I'm sure some of you are on my Twitch channel watching right now, so you know what I play. September 6th, we'll be playing some Starfield. So be sure to
Star
check me out
Fox,
on that.
yay!
And you are welcome, Elizabeth. Thank you for we missed you. We're glad you're back. Thank you for being back. We definitely appreciate you. We appreciate you, James. We appreciate you, Apple. We appreciate you, Little Beans and Rice. We appreciate each and every one of you. And every week we're going to keep bringing you the best in all things paranormal, esoteric, and religion, and science, and all the good stuff that makes you scratch your head and wonder why we are so uncanny. As always, why be boring when you can be uncanny? We will see you folks next week.